American Revolution, 1776-1783. These are your core objectives for Chapter 5. Make sure that you review these as you're reading the chapter to make sure that you get all the major points within the chapter. In March 1776, the British decided that for mostly strategic military purposes that they would move their center of operation from Boston to New York. New York had a better harbor, it was more centrally located, and it also had a very large loyalist population. So they began to move their forces toward New York. General Washington, who is in command of the Continental Army, would be charged with trying to defend New York. He's greatly outnumbered, he's greatly outgunned, so his efforts to defend New York City were unsuccessful, and the British will be able to take control of New York City, and they will hold New York throughout the remainder of the war. Washington will take up a position in that same region in an area called Brooklyn Heights, which today is just Brooklyn, where he will be keeping an eye on that main British force. What we see strategically for Washington, his role as the commander of the Continental Army is to always stay where the main British forces are. So since the main British forces are in the New York area, Washington will be in that area. In his role there in Brooklyn Heights, Washington realizes that he can't take the British on head to head. He doesn't have enough men, he doesn't have enough supplies, so his strategy is basically guerrilla warfare, hit and run tactics. When the British go out on patrol, attacking small units of them and capturing their weapons, striking at them early in the morning, late in the evenings when they're not expecting it, because his goal is to just keep an army in the field, to keep fighting and keep his men's morale up, while the British have to completely defeat the Americans and defeat the American army. By December of 1776, things were looking pretty bad for the Americans. In the late summer, General Howe, who is now in control or in charge of the British forces, decided that he was going to attack Washington's army and end this rebel nonsense and end this war. And so he begins assaulting Washington's forces at Brooklyn Heights in August of 1776. Washington will be defeated in those battles, but he and the army will be able to retreat, and they retreat across Long Island into New Jersey. All along the way, the British are pursuing them. Eventually, his forces will even have to cross the Delaware River and take refuge. So throughout the late summer and fall of 1776, Washington and the Continental Army suffer many defeats, having to retreat and fall back time and time again. So by the time we get to December of 1776, morale is very low. They're low on supplies, and Washington is afraid that when his troops go into winter headquarters, that many of them may just decide to quit and go home. So he decided that what his troops needed was a great victory to keep up their morale. So he decided that he would counterattack the British, that he would launch an assault on the British. So he has to decide on a good time and a strategic location where he thinks he can win, because if he attacks and loses again, it'll be worse than before. So he decided that the British troops must be very strung out, and they were, going from New York all through New Jersey. And so he needed to pick a location where they were not as heavily fortified, and where he hoped that he could defeat them. And so he decided to attack Trenton, New Jersey. And the main reason he decided to attack Trenton was really because it was controlled by Hessian mercenaries, who were German troops that were hired by the British to help them in this fight. And even though the Hessians were excellent soldiers, as mercenaries usually are, they're soldiers for hire. So they aren't going to fight to the death. They're not going to fight to the very end. So Washington figured that if he could attack them, surprise them, and it looked like they were going to be defeated, then he would be able to win there. The second part of his strategy involves surprising them, picking the right time. So he decided that Christmas night would be the best time to attack the Hessians at Trenton. Traditionally, in Western culture, there was no fighting on Christmas, and so he figured that the Hessians would be more relaxed at that time. They would not be expecting an assault, and so he could attack them. So on Christmas night, 1776, Washington and his troops will cross the Delaware. And on your slide, you see that famous picture of Washington standing up in the boat. Of course, we mostly believe that Washington was too smart to stand up in the boat because it was a very rough night. The winds were very high. It was very cold and icy. But they finally made it across the Delaware River, and they will march on Trenton. The strategy worked. They caught the Hessians off guard. They had, retired for the night. They had been feasting all day and relaxed, and so he caught them off guard, and he was able to defeat the Hessians at Trenton. In the defeat of the Hessians, he captured about 1,000 Hessian soldiers as prisoners of war. About 28 or so were actually killed in the battle, so it was a very good victory for Washington and the Continental Army. About a week later, on January 3rd, 1777, he will follow up that victory at Trenton by attacking the British at Princeton, New Jersey. Fighting there was a little more involved, a little more difficult, because it was traditional British Army soldiers that he was fighting. But once again, he will come out victorious. So by early January of 1777, Washington has a couple of victories in his pocket. His soldiers are feeling much better about themselves, and so he feels more confident about going into winter headquarters. There's a little YouTube link at the bottom of this slide. If you're interested in more information about the Battle of Trenton and the Battle of Princeton, you can click on that link, and there's a short little YouTube video that you can watch on that. This map just simply shows us the major battles in New York and New Jersey in 1776 and 1777. When we look at the battles of Trenton and Princeton and those victories, we often refer to them as great moral victories that kept up the morale of Washington's troops during this rough winter that is about to come about for them. But strategically, these battles were also important because while the British will hold on to New York through the duration of the war, they will struggle in New Jersey, and the American forces will continue to have control of certain areas of New Jersey, and that puts a damper on the British strategy of divide and conquer the American colonies, dividing the New England colonies from the southern colonies. And so because they can never gain control of New Jersey, they never have complete control of all the northern colonies. During the winter of 1777, the British began further developing their divide and conquer strategy, and they came up with a battle plan that they hoped would end the war. The plan was a three-pronged attack on the New England or the northern colonies with the goal of separating them away from the rest of the colonies. The way the strategy was to work was that General Burgoyne, who commanded the Canadian forces, would march southward into New York State. Colonel St. Leger, who was out in the west, would begin moving his forces eastward through the Mohawk Valley. And General Howe, who who of course was in charge of the British forces in New York City, would begin moving his forces northward up the Hudson River with the goal, as I said, of isolating that New England region away from the rest of the colonies. New England, of course, was the hotbed of the Revolution, so they felt that if they could isolate them and defeat New England, the Revolution would come to an end. Well, the plan is a very well-organized, well-developed plan, and General Burgoyne had come up with a plan, but it's not going to be very well executed because, one, they underestimated some of the American forces, and two, General Howe, who was a little jealous of General Burgoyne, made his own plan, and he's not going to follow the rest of the plan. Early in, late in September, they began putting the plan into place. General Burgoyne begins to move his forces southward from Canada, and Colonel St. Leger begins moving his forces eastward through the Mohawk Valley. Things go very wrong for Leger very early on. He is going to run into some American, what we called irregulars, some of our frontiersmen, militiamen that had put together their own forces to fight the British. These American irregulars were commanded by General Nicholas Herkimer, and they are going to defeat Leger's forces at the Battle of Oriskany, and so Leger's forces are taken out of the picture. But of course, because communications are so slow during this time period, General Burgoyne does not know that, and he continues slowly moving his forces southward. He is encumbered with this huge line of supply, because a lot of the British generals, and Burgoyne being one of those, like to travel with all of their luxury, so he's bringing these big tents and his beautiful silver service and his China dining services, and he and his officers are even bringing many of their mistresses with them, and of course they have, you know, lots of luggage. We women, we always like to have lots of luggage, and so they're moving quite slowly. Also, the American frontiersmen are slowing them down by felling trees and causing disruptions in their movements, just really grinding them almost to a halt at times. And so things are not going to be moving as quickly as Burgoyne's timeline had called for them to go. Meanwhile, General Howe does begin moving his forces out of New York, but instead of moving northward up the Hudson River into upstate New York to meet Burgoyne, he moves southward. He has his own plan. He decides that he will attack Philadelphia, because Philadelphia is the unofficial capital of the rebels. This is where the Second Continental Congress was meeting, and so he figured if he could capture Philadelphia, which was also the most wealthy city in the colonies, then he could bring the war to an end, and he would get all the great accolades that would come along with that. So Howe is also out of the picture. By the time Burgoyne realizes that he's all by himself, he's in upstate New York, and American forces who have figured out part of the plan, led by General Horatio Gates, have marshaled all of available resources, calling in militias, calling in regular troops to attack Burgoyne in upstate New York. The Battle of Saratoga takes place at Saratoga simply really because that's where the British forces and the American forces met. Saratoga doesn't have any real military significance in and of itself. It's not strategically important. It's very much like Gettysburg will be later in the Civil War. So General Gates and his forces launched this massive assault on Burgoyne, and Burgoyne obviously realizes now that he's by himself and he's not going to get any help because Leger has been defeated and Howe is not coming. The Americans did, though, almost lose the Battle of Saratoga. At times, it looked like they were going to lose. And actually, if it hadn't been for some brilliant military moves by a young officer, Benedict Arnold, we may have actually lost the Battle of Saratoga. But they ended up defeating Burgoyne's forces, and General Burgoyne will surrender to General Horatio Gates, and the Battle of Saratoga is a great victory for the Americans. Saratoga is often referred to as the turning point of the American Revolution, even though there's going to be many years of fighting left. But it is the first big major victory for the Americans, the regular army fighting the British regular armies. And probably the most decisive thing is that after this battle, we get more buy-in from Europe, especially from France. The French are going to say, hey, we think the Americans can win, so maybe we'll go and help them out. And then, of course, other European countries like Spain will also come in to help us. After the Battle of Saratoga, negotiations between the U.S. and France really pick up regarding getting France to openly recognize the United States as an independent country and give us open assistance. Benjamin Franklin had been in France since the beginning of the war, trying to build this alliance with the French. But until we had this major victory, we're not going to be able to convince them that we're a good bet. And so they were helping us secretly, funneling money to us, but they're not going to openly come in and assist us until after the victory at Saratoga. Ben Franklin in 1778 will ultimately be able to negotiate what becomes known as the Franco-American Alliance. In the Franco-American Alliance, the French will recognize the United States as an independent country. They will also pledge to assist us in any way, militarily and financially, with the revolution, and that's going to end up being very important for us. And in exchange for that, we also pledge in the future that if the French go to war against the British, that we will assist them in any wars that they have against the British. So what we sometimes don't remember about the Franco-American Alliance is that it is a mutual defense agreement. They're helping us in this war, and we're pledging to help them in the future. The significance of the alliance is tremendous. You cannot really overplay the French assistance in the war. French money helped us win the American Revolution. French military resources, such as their navy, will be very valuable to us. The French soldiers will volunteer and come to America and assist us. Probably one of the biggest things that we see from the Franco-American Alliance is that it is going to now divide the British's attention. The British can no longer just worry about what is happening in North America, because France is just right there across the English Channel. And so once the French come in as an alliance with us, then the British have to divide their forces. They're going to have to leave some of their navy and some of their military forces in Europe to combat any attempts by the French to invade Great Britain. The French alliance is so important that many believe that we could not have been successful in our revolution without this alliance. One of the other things that we see after the French come in to openly assist us and recognize us is the Spanish will also come in and openly assist and recognize us. We don't get as much military aid from the Spanish, but we do get significant amounts of money and loans from the Spanish. We also see that, as I was saying earlier, that some French soldiers will come over to help in the war. One of probably the most prestigious and the most well-known of these was the Marquis de Lafayette. He was a young aristocrat in France. He became very enamored of the American Revolution, the ideas of equality of man, which are going to drive him to come to America at his own expense with his own military forces and assist in many of the battles. He will fight along George Washington in many battles, and he and George Washington become great friends. Another European who's going to play a very significant role in the American Revolution is a Prussian, a German military officer, the Baron Frederick von Steuben. He will come over and help to train the Continental Army. Before von Steuben, our army was very disorganized. They had great heart, but they really were not a professional army. Von Steuben will bring those Prussian military strategies and that Prussian military training to the Continental Army and really help to make us a real army. And so the War for Independence became a global war really after the Franco-American alliance, because the French and the Spanish and others will come in to assist America in our fighting. Unfortunately for the Americans, after the victory at Saratoga, everything won't be easy going. We're going to have a lot of difficult times ahead of us, even though it is the, quote, turning point of the Revolution. And for instance, that winter of 1778 was a very harsh winter, and when the Continental Army goes into winter headquarters at Valley Forge, they are going to suffer greatly during that winter. There's not enough food, there's not enough blankets, clothing, the men don't have boots. About a quarter of the men who were at Valley Forge will actually die there because of disease or dying from exposure to the cold there. It's during this winter at Valley Forge that Thomas Paine will write another one of his very famous works dealing with the American Revolution called The Crisis. And you may be a little bit familiar with it. It's the one that starts, "These are the times that try men's souls," the summer soldier, you know. So he wrote The Crisis to be kind of a cheer, a pep rally thing for the American forces at Valley Forge. The American Army will emerge from Valley Forge a little tattered, a little smaller in number, but ready to fight on and win the Revolution. This map just shows us some of the major campaigns in New York and Pennsylvania in 1777. You can see the movements of St. Leger's armies and Burgoyne's armies when we were talking about the Battle of Saratoga. And you can, if you look further down, you can see Howe's army and his attack on Philadelphia during that same time. In this winter of 1778, 1779, as we were saying earlier, there's going to be a lot of hardship on the American soldiers. And through that whole year, 1778, 1779, we suffered many defeats. And really the only kind of shining point after Saratoga was in the war in the West. In the West, most of the American forces are going to be led by George Rogers Clark, and a lot of the fighting is going to be along the Mississippi River. The British recognized the value of the Mississippi River in moving troops and supplies, and later, of course, if they defeated us economically, you know, having control of the Mississippi River. And for that same reason, the Americans are going to want to hold on to the areas around the Mississippi River. In that time frame, in February of 1779, the Americans are going to defeat the British at the Battle of Kaskaskia, which is there along the Mississippi River. A few weeks later, they're going to defeat the British again at Cahokia. Remember, this is the area that is close to St. Louis, so a major region. And then a few weeks later, they are also going to be able to defeat the British at the Battle of Vincennes, which is closer to the Indiana region. The significance of the Western victories is that they will give the Americans claim to those Western territories when the war is over. When we get to the peace treaty, we'll see that after we won, we did not just get the 13 colonies. We got the 13 colonies and all of the land all the way to the Mississippi River. So that gives us claim to that land, and we should thank George Rogers Clark and those Western frontiersmen for those victories. This map shows those Western battles. You can see Clark's forces are the blue line and the British are the red line, and you can see the fighting that's going to occur in that region, and you can see that in proximity to the 13 colonies. So if we move past the Appalachian Mountains all the way to the Mississippi River, that's going to give us a large claim to land after the war is over. The most famous trader in American history is Benedict Arnold. Benedict Arnold went from being the hero of the Battle of Saratoga to being this famous trader. He was wounded in the battle, and he became very bitter because he felt that he did not receive the accolades that he should have received for his part in the victory at Saratoga. So during his convalescence, he became acquainted with some loyalists, and a loyalist young lady, Peggy Shipton. He fell in love with her, and they got married. The two of them plotted with the British under Major John Andre for Benedict Arnold to become a British spy. In the beginning, Benedict Arnold, who worked in logistics in Philadelphia, was just providing the British with some information regarding things that were happening in that area. But eventually, Benedict Arnold was given the command of West Point after he had been overlooked for his own command for many months, and he was finally given the command of West Point. So the British then worked with Benedict Arnold for him to provide them with the plans for West Point. Benedict Arnold and Major Andre met. They exchanged the plans and departed company. On the way back, Major Andre, who was dressed in civilian clothing, was stopped by an American patrol. And when they were discussing with him, and they began to, while they were discussing what he was doing out in this area, they decided that they would search him. They found the plans for West Point in his boots, and at that point they realized that he must be a British operative. He wasn't in his uniform, so they didn't know that until they found the plans for West Point. Benedict Arnold had made it safely back to West Point. Major Andre was taken to the commander of these soldiers that were out on patrol, and that commander gave the information to George Washington. Benedict Arnold quickly found out about the capture of Major Andre, and he realized that he would be caught soon, so he escaped over to the British lines. Major Andre will have a very difficult fate. Because he had decided not to wear his uniform, he was treated as a spy, and spies were hanged. So if he had worn his British uniform, he probably would have been treated as a prisoner of war, and eventually he would have been released to the British. Benedict Arnold will serve out the rest of the war working for the British, and he will even fight for the British in some of the southern campaigns. When the war was over, since he was so hated in America, he and his wife Peggy went to England, where he lived out the rest of his days, actually very bitter because he never got the accolades and the great wealth that the British had promised him for his treachery. Beginning in 1780, the British will turn more of their attention to the southern campaigns. They will name General Cornwallis as the commander for the South, and they began putting more resources into campaigning in the South. They did this because they had not been as successful as they had hoped in the northern campaigns and in the middle colonies. So they're hoping that they can capitalize on loyalist support in the South. As early as 1778, the British had had success at the Battle of Savannah, where they had taken over Savannah and then quickly overrun Georgia. So early on in the war, Georgia fell under British control. But after taking Georgia, they had more difficult time controlling the rest of the southern colonies. But in 1780, when they began to put more of these resources in, they did begin to have greater success. In May of 1780, there's going to be a major battle fought between the British and the Americans at Charleston. Charleston was the major harbor of South Carolina, and really a major harbor for the South. This is a devastating loss for the Americans because they are going to lose 5,000 soldiers and 300 cannons when they lose Charleston. It is a great victory for the British. For the rest of the summer of 1780, we're going to see a great deal of fighting throughout South Carolina as the British are gaining more and more headway in South Carolina. In August of 1780, there's going to be another major engagement between the British and the Americans at Camden. In this battle, the Americans had sent Horatio Gates, the hero from the Battle of Saratoga, down to lead the American forces, and they hoped that he could rally the troops to a victory. Unfortunately, it will be another defeat for the Americans. So at the close of the summer 1780, things are really not looking good for the Americans in the South. At this point, Cornwallis gets a little full of himself, and he begins to move his soldiers more into North Carolina, kind of stringing out his line and making for a long line of supply. In October of 1780, the Americans decided that they would attack a loyalist group that were working with Cornwallis and the British, and the Americans will attack this group at Kings Mountain, which is closer to the border between the two states, and they will defeat the British at the Battle of Kings Mountain. This was a great victory for the Americans, not so much because they won a huge chunk of land, but it gave them a little boost in their morale and kept them fighting throughout the rest of the winter of 1780. In January of 1781, the Americans are going to stage a major defense at Cowpens, which is on the border between North and South Carolina. At Cowpens, we will have General Morgan leading the American troops. He will be reinforced with General Horatio Gates' troops, as well as American militiamen. They lured Cornwallis basically into a trap. Cornwallis thought he was only fighting the militia, and he thought that the group was much smaller than it was. And by the time he realized that there was this large contingent of regular American forces there, he had gotten himself into a trap, and the Americans will be able to defeat Cornwallis at the Battle of Cowpens. A couple of months later, in March of 1781, Cornwallis tries to recoup his losses, and he will launch an assault on the American forces at Guilford Courthouse, which is in North Carolina. The battle at Guilford Courthouse is a very bloody engagement, both sides losing many soldiers. But in the end, the British will be victorious. It's almost a tie, but in the end, the British will be victorious. After the bloody engagement at Guilford Courthouse, Cornwallis decides that he will move his troops out of the Carolinas back into Virginia, specifically to the Yorktown Peninsula, where he can regroup and reorganize, get supplies from the British Navy, and plan his next mode of attack. The two maps on this slide show us the battles that we just discussed. You can see that the red lines show the movement of the British armies under Cornwallis, and the blue lines show Horatio Gates and General Morgan and the American forces. So then on the other map, we see the Battle of Yorktown, and it's going to show you where all of the major players are going to be at Yorktown as we move into discussing that on the next slide. The Battle of Yorktown is considered to be the last major battle of the American Revolution. There will be a few skirmishes fought after this, but it is the last major engagement. After Cornwallis moved his forces to the Yorktown Peninsula, the American forces will follow behind him and blockade him in onto the peninsula. So he's trapped, where his only method of escape would be using the British Navy. The American forces, led by General Wayne, will be reinforced by General Lafayette, the Marquis de Lafayette's forces, the Frenchmen that had come to help, as well as Horatio Gates' forces. Pretty much everything we had in the South will be brought to bear on the British at Yorktown. Additionally, word will be sent to General Washington that the British Southern Army under Cornwallis is trapped on the Yorktown Peninsula. So Washington will leave a small contingent of troops fighting the British in New York, and he and another French battalion under the command of General Rochambeau will move quickly down to Virginia to reinforce the Americans, and George Washington will take over command at that time, of course. When Cornwallis realizes that he is greatly outnumbered on the Yorktown Peninsula and that he can't fight his way off the peninsula, he calls for assistance from the British Navy. At this time, we see the very importance of the French coming in. The French Navy, which was under the command of the Comte de Grasse, will come in and blockade the Yorktown Peninsula from the sea. The British Navy cannot get to Cornwallis, and so Cornwallis will be totally trapped on the peninsula. When Cornwallis realizes that he can't get off the peninsula by fighting or by the escape from the British Navy, then he decides that the best avenue for him would be to surrender. But even at this time, he is very arrogant, and he refuses to surrender his sword personally to General George Washington. So he sends his second in command out to surrender the sword to Washington. Cornwallis' second, instead of taking the sword to General Washington, took it to the French commander Rochambeau. Rochambeau refused to take the sword. He said, "I am not the commander here, General Washington is." And so, of course, by this time, General Washington was offended, and so he refused to accept Cornwallis' sword, and he had his second in command take Cornwallis' sword. So we see we have a lot of arrogance and all this play among these soldiers, even at the light of the defeat in battle. Yorktown is a very significant battle because it made the British realize that the war could continue for years as long as the French were assisting the Americans, and they don't want that to happen. The British people don't want the war to continue, and so it is after Yorktown that they decide that it will be best for them to begin to negotiate with the Americans. This is a huge turning point for the British because, remember, in the beginning, the British said that they would only accept unconditional surrender, that the Americans were colonists and they would do what they said. Now they are willing to negotiate with the Americans, and they're aware that that may mean that they may have to give huge concessions to the Americans, maybe even independence. This map shows us in more detail some of the movements in the Battle of Yorktown. You can see the major armies, you can see the movement of the navies, so it gives us a really good visual depiction of the battle. The peace negotiations to end the American Revolution were held in Paris. Representing the Americans will be Ben Franklin, our longtime diplomat to France. As he will be joined by John Jay and John Adams. At the peace conference, there will be many problems because you're trying to get the British and the French and the Americans to agree to the peace terms. The Americans basically want independence and some reasonable concessions from the British. The British at this time really just want to bring a conclusion to the war and still be able to have some trading relationships with the Americans. But the French really wanted the British to lose more. They aren't ready for the war to be over. They're hoping that they can gain some of the lost territory that they've lost to the British over the years if the war continues and they can continue to contribute. So it seemed like every time the Americans and the British came to a reasonable peace terms, the French would refuse to agree with those. So finally, Ben Franklin decided that the only thing he could do was to go behind the back of the French and make peace terms excluding the French. And so that's what we will do. The American Revolution will end with the Treaty of Paris, 1783. Under the terms of the treaty, the U.S. Will gain its independence. Great Britain will recognize us as an independent country. The borders for the new country will be Canada in the north, the Mississippi River in the west, and the 31st parallel, which is roughly the northern border of Florida in the south. So this will give us a lot of growing room. We won't just have those 13 original colonies. We will have that western territory going all the way to the Mississippi River. Additionally, the British will give the United States the right to fish off of Newfoundland. The British will promise that they will remove their troops from all forts in America with all deliberate speed. That comes back to haunt us a little bit because there's no exact timeline on that, and that's going to cause a problem a few years down the road. In exchange, the U.S. promises that we will pay all of our debts due to English merchants and that we will restore all property to the loyalists. We won't treat them as traitors, as it were. The significance of the treaty, of course, is first of all, that the United States was created as a new country. So this is the beginning of us officially being a country. But it also goes deeper than that. The American Revolution is going to help spark other revolutions throughout the world. It will help to cause the French Revolution, because the French basically bankrupted themselves helping us in our revolution, and that causes problems at home in France. It will also inspire the Latin American countries to rise up against Spain and fight for their independence. So the war has much more significance than just for us as a country. It helps to spark these other revolutions. And of course, in creating this new country, we're going to create an entirely new way of governing, something that has never been done before, as we will see when we move into Chapter 6. This map just shows us what North America looks like after the American Revolution. You can see that green area is now the new United States, and you see that it goes all the way to the Mississippi River. So we will have a vast area of growing room that will help us expand as a new nation and be more economically viable than if we had only had that 13 original territories. This slide is just one of those charts that I like to give you from time to time that shows all of the major battles in the war. It's divided up between the north and the frontier in the south, and then the very early fighting. It gives the exact dates of the battles. I will not ask you to memorize the exact dates, but you do need to know which dates occurred first. And then, of course, it gives you the outcomes in the war. Well, how did the war affect different minorities in the Americas at the time? First, let's look at African Americans. Many free blacks actually fought in the war in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. You have more free blacks in those two colonies, and so they will fight for independence for those those colonies. Slavery was already weak in many of the northern colonies, and the war will help to end it in some of those colonies. We'll see when they write their new state constitutions, they will make slavery illegal. But for the time being, it will still be legal in most of the new states. Some free blacks decided to leave North America altogether. Some will go to the West Indies. Some will go to Canada, where they felt that they might have a better life, because the British had already outlawed slavery in their states and territories, and so there will be no slavery in Canada. And some will even return to Africa and go to the new country of Sierra Leone, which had been created by free blacks that had left slavery in other parts of the world. The war will have a devastating effect on the Native Americans. Most of the Native American tribes fought on the side of the British, and they suffered really heavy casualties because the British really didn't take great care of them either. And when the war was over, because they had fought for the British, the Americans saw this as an opportunity to get revenge on the Native Americans, and an opportunity to take more of their land from them. So we see after the American Revolution, more of the Native American tribes will be pushed further west out of their traditional lands, enabling more Americans to take over more of their lands. What were the elements of our success, or the components of our success? How did these little colonies defeat one of the great powers of Europe? Well, of course, as we've discussed before, Washington's leadership. He was one of those commanders who just inspired his men. Even in the darkest days, when there was little food, little ammunition, when they didn't have enough boots and blankets, the men continued to look up to Washington, and they would do whatever he wanted, and he was able to keep that army in the field, win those major battles that he needed to win, so that we could be ultimately victorious. The British, while they had a numerical advantage and they had a monetary advantage, they're fighting far from home. And so many of their soldiers really didn't want to be here. They're not fighting for a cause. The American soldiers are fighting for a cause. They're fighting for freedom. They're fighting for the right to run their own country. The British were mostly conscripted or drafted, and they don't want to be there. Additionally, there's some political fighting in Britain. Not all of the British parliamentary leaders felt that the Americans should be forced to stay part of the empire. They said we should just allow them to leave. So there is division in Britain that that played into the Americans' favor. And of course, one of the huge factors that helped in our success was the French assistance. Without the French money, without the French Navy, without some of the French soldiers that came over, like the Marquis de Lafayette and General Rochambeau, we probably could not have been successful in our fight for independence. So these are some of the major components that allowed us to win our independence. The war is also going to be an engine of political change. The war will spark us to create a new and different kind of government than had ever been created before. The former colonies are now states, and they are going to write new state constitutions. And one of the elements that we see in these new state constitutions that will be widely adopted in the new country, and even as on a national level as well as the state level, is separation of church and state. There will be no established state churches, meaning that you will not be required to attend or pay taxes that support any particular church. People will have the freedom of religion to support whatever religion they want, or not to support any religion if they don't want to. We will also see that the new state constitutions limited the power of the governors. Under the colonial system, in some of the colonies, the governors were almost like dictators. So in the new state constitutions, we see that the governors often had much reduced powers than they had under the colonial system. And going along with that, we will see that the legislatures will have more power. Somebody has to rule, and so the legislatures, which are the representatives of the people, will have more power under these new state constitutions. We also see that many of the northern states, like Massachusetts, like Rhode Island, will abolish slavery. And this is when we begin to see the slave states and the non-slave states emerging in America, going back to the very beginning when there were only 13 states. Some adopted slavery and some opted to abolish slavery.